On a Wednesday morning in March, at a county tax lien auction held in a converted conference room on the second floor of the Cuyahoga County Administrative Building in Cleveland, Ohio, a woman in a charcoal blazer raised a numbered paddle and purchased a mechanic's garage on Prospect Avenue for $10,200. She did not know the man who owned it. She knew only that the parcel was in a corridor she had been assembling for 14 months, that the tax lien had been outstanding for 22 months, and that at $10,000 it was the most cost-efficient acquisition she had made in a year of difficult acquisitions. She held the paddle with the composure of someone who had attended 100 of these auctions and understood that composure was not indifference but discipline, the discipline of not showing what something was worth to you before you had paid what it cost. Her name was Dara Osai. She was 44 years old. She was the founder and CEO of Prospect Capital Developments, a commercial real estate development firm based in Cleveland that had, over the previous 8 years, become the primary private redevelopment engine in the city's Midtown corridor. The stretch of Prospect Avenue and the surrounding blocks that had been the subject of city planning documents and economic development reports for 20 years, and the subject of actual investment from almost nobody until Dara had decided it was time. The man who owned the garage had not been at the auction. He had been at the Cuyahoga County Children and Family Services office on the same morning, fighting a school enrollment dispute for his daughter that had been generated by a clerical error in the district system, and that required his physical presence to resolve. He had received the tax lien notice 14 months earlier and had been making partial payments toward the outstanding balance when his truck's transmission had failed in November, and his transmission repair fund had temporarily become his partial payment fund, and the partial payment fund had temporarily been suspended while he rebuilt it. He was aware the lien auction was that morning. He had intended to be there. He had called the county clerk's office on Tuesday afternoon to ask whether the auction could be postponed given that he was 3 months away from paying the balance in full. The clerk had explained, professionally and without cruelty, that the auction schedule was not subject to individual appeals. His name was Marcus Webb. He was 39 years old. He had an 8-year-old daughter named Aaliyah. He had operated Webb Automotive Service on Prospect Avenue for 11 years, in a building that had been his father's before it was his, which his father had bought in 1988 for $62,000, and which Marcus had inherited at 31 when his father had died of a stroke on a Tuesday morning in August, alone in the shop, at 63 years old. He found out about the auction at 11:47 that morning, when he left the Children and Family Services office and checked his phone and found a voicemail from his attorney. He sat in the parking lot of the county building for 11 minutes. He called his attorney back. The attorney explained the situation and the options, which were limited but not zero, and which would require time and money and patience of a kind that Marcus Webb had demonstrated across 11 years of keeping a small garage solvent on a stretch of Cleveland that had been inconvenient to most of the people who might otherwise have been his customers. He said, "How long do I have?" His attorney said, "The redemption window is 1 year. If you can pay the lien amount plus penalties and legal fees within 12 months, you can reclaim the property." Marcus said, "How much total?" His attorney said a number. Marcus said, "I'll have it." His attorney said, "Marcus," he said, "I'll have it." He drove to Aaliyah's school for pickup. She got in the truck and looked at him with the specific look she had, the one that assessed his face the way mechanics assessed a dashboard. She was 8 years old. She said, "What happened?" He said, "Something I'm going to fix." She said, "Is it fixable?" He said, "Everything is fixable. It just depends on how much work you're willing to do." She said, "Then you'll fix it." He drove home through the Midtown corridor, past the garage with its sign, Webb Automotive Service, established 1988, and thought about his father's hands and his father's tools and the 11 years he had spent in that building keeping something alive that deserved to stay alive, and about what it was going to take to get it back. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this one travels. Stay until the end, because the $4 million was not the end of this story. It was the proof of what the story had always been about. Leonard Webb had bought the building on Prospect Avenue in 1988 for reasons that his contemporaries in Cleveland's black business community had understood and that the broader commercial real estate market had not. Prospect Avenue in 1988 was not an address that attracted investment. It was an address that attracted the specific kind of businessperson who understood that an address's present condition and its future potential were different measurements, and who had both the patience and the competence to do something with the gap between them. Leonard had been a mechanic for 20 years before he bought the building, first at a dealership in Lakewood, then at an independent shop in Cleveland Heights, then on his own in a rented bay near East 55th. He had saved carefully, with the discipline of someone who had grown up without the option of saving carelessly, and had accumulated the down payment over 7 years while running the rented bay and building a customer base that followed him the way genuine customers followed genuine mechanics, which was without advertising and without discount. The building was 4,000 square feet on a corner lot, with 3 service bays, a parts room, a waiting area, and a small office that Leonard had furnished with 2 chairs, and a desk salvaged from an office clearance and a photograph of his wife, Evelyn, on the wall that remained there through 30 years of the building's life, and through the years after Evelyn's death in 2004, and through Marcus's 11 years of running the shop after Leonard's death in 2014. Marcus had grown up in the shop the way children grew up in their parents' workplaces when the parent worked with their hands, and the work was present and visible and explainable at the level a child could absorb. He had held tools at 6 and changed oil at 12 and diagnosed his first transmission problem at 15. And by 17, he was the shop's most reliable Saturday presence, capable of handling any job that came in when Leonard needed him and capable of recognizing the jobs that needed Leonard when they came in. He had gone to Cuyahoga Community College for an automotive technology degree, which his father had supported not because the credential was necessary for the skills Marcus already had, but because Leonard understood that the credential was necessary for the world Marcus was going to operate in, and that the world frequently demanded proof of knowledge that was already present, and that the person who presented the proof alongside the knowledge had more options than the person who presented only the knowledge. He had married at 27, a woman named Diane who was a registered nurse at Cleveland Clinic, and who was, by every measure, the better organizational mind in the marriage. The person who tracked the shop's finances with the same clinical precision she brought to patient charts, who had identified the tax lien problem 2 full years before it became critical, and who had set up the partial payment system that had been working until the truck transmission intervened. Diane had died of a pulmonary embolism on a Saturday morning in February, 4 years before the auction, when Aaliyah was 4 years old. She had been 34. The embolism had been, in the brutal arithmetic of such things, entirely unforeseeable and entirely final, and the years that followed had been the kind of years that remade a person whether or not the person was consulted about the remaking. Marcus had kept the shop running in those years by understanding, with the practical clarity that grief sometimes produced, that the shop was the continuity. It was what Leonard had built and what Diane had helped protect and what Aaliyah would inherit if he kept it. The days when the grief was loudest, he had gone to the shop early and opened the bay doors and done the work, because the work was what there was and what there had always been, and doing it was the most honest response to the situation he could find. The tax lien had been 22 months outstanding by the time of the auction. It had originated with a county reassessment of the property that had doubled the tax bill in a single year, which Marcus had contested through the appropriate channels, and which the contestation process had not resolved before the outstanding balance had accumulated past the threshold for auction. The details of this sequence, the reassessment, the appeal, the partial payments, the truck transmission, the final 3 months he had needed, were the details that the auction process did not consider and was not designed to consider, because the auction process was a mechanism for resolving a specific financial instrument and not a mechanism for assessing the human context of the instrument. Dara Ose had paid $10,200 for something worth considerably more than that. This was not a moral failing. It was the outcome of a system operating as designed. The moral content, if any, was in what happened after. Dara Ose had grown up in Cleveland. This was not incidental to the Prospect Capital story. It was the Prospect Capital story. She had grown up specifically in the neighborhood adjacent to the Midtown corridor, the daughter of a Ghanaian immigrant engineer and a Cleveland-born schoolteacher, in a household that was middle class by income and intellectually demanding by culture. A household in which competence was expected, underachievement was examined rather than accepted, and the city outside the door was understood as a system with problems that problems people could solve. She had studied finance at Case Western Reserve and had gone directly into commercial real estate at a firm in Cleveland, where she had spent 8 years learning the industry from the inside with the specific intent of eventually doing something the industry was not doing. The something the industry was not doing in Cleveland in the early 2010s, was investing in the Midtown corridor in a serious and systematic way. There were reasons for this, complicated reasons involving risk assessment models and cap rate expectations, and the specific reluctance of institutional capital to move into neighborhoods that it had categorized as high risk based on historical data that was itself the product of historical disinvestment, a circular logic that Dara found both analytically incorrect and personally offensive. She had founded Prospect Capital Developments at 36 with a first fund that was smaller than it should have been and larger than anyone had expected to raise, given what she was proposing to do with it. The first fund had produced returns that the second fund's LPs had found compelling. The second fund had produced returns that the third fund's LPs had described as exceptional. The third fund was currently deploying into the corridor that Dara had been assembling for 14 months, the corridor that ran along Prospect Avenue from East 30th to East 55th, encompassing 27 individual parcels, 17 of which she had already acquired, and 9 of which were in various stages of negotiation or legal process. The Webb Automotive parcel was number 23 on her acquisition list. It was not a strategic priority in the sense that she could not complete the project without it. It was a priority in the sense that it sat at a corner of the corridor that the project's architect had identified as a key pedestrian node, and that a corner parcel at a pedestrian node was the kind of position that determined the quality of the entire block's development, and that Dara had learned over 8 years that the quality of the entire block's development was the difference between a project that performed well and a project that performed exceptionally. She had not known when she purchased the parcel that the building had been in continuous operation as a mechanic's garage for 35 years. She had not known about Leonard Webb. She had not known about Diane. She had not known about Aaliyah. She knew about it on Thursday, the day after the auction, when her project manager sent her the due diligence file that included the chain of title and the operating history, because the project manager was thorough in the way that Dara required her team to be thorough, and thorough meant knowing the full context of what they had acquired. She read the file. She sat at her desk in the Prospect Capital office on Euclid Avenue for 22 minutes with the file in front of her, and made no other calls, and answered no other messages. Then she called her project manager and asked for Marcus Webb's contact information. Marcus was under a 2019 Chevrolet Silverado performing a brake line replacement when his phone rang with a number he did not recognize. He let it ring. He finished the segment of line he was on because finishing a segment was the unit of interruption that kept the work coherent. Then he slid out on the creeper and answered. The voice said, "Mr. Webb, my name is Dara Osai. I'm the CEO of Prospect Capital Developments. I purchased your property at the county auction yesterday." He said nothing for a moment. He sat up on the creeper and leaned his back against the Silverado's running board and looked at the shop ceiling, which had the specific water stain pattern he had been meaning to address for 2 years. He said, "What can I do for you?" She said, "I'd like to meet. I've reviewed the property file and I want to discuss the situation in person before I make any decisions about the parcel." He said, "What kind of decisions?" She said, "I'd rather discuss it in person." He said, "I'm working." She said, "I can come to the shop." A pause. He looked at the water stain. He said, "Tomorrow morning, 7:30. She said, "I'll be there." She arrived at 7:25, which he clocked because punctuality was the first legible data point about any person, and 7:25 was one of 2 possible readings. Either she had allowed extra time because she was uncertain about the address, or she was the kind of person who arrived early and had been early her entire professional life. He assessed the second reading as more likely when she got out of the car, a 5-year-old Honda Accord that was not the vehicle he had expected, and walked to the shop door with the purposeful ease of someone who was where they had planned to be. He had the shop open. He had the Silverado still on the lift. He was making coffee in the waiting area on the $12 Mr. Coffee machine that had been in the shop, since his father bought it at a Kmart on Euclid in 2001, and that still made acceptable coffee because Marcus cleaned it properly, which was, in his observation, the only thing standing between any coffee machine and failure. He offered her coffee. She took it. She sat in one of the 2 waiting area chairs, green vinyl, original to the building, and looked at the shop with the attention of someone reading a space rather than merely occupying it. She said, "This building has been a garage since 1988. He said, 36 years. She said, "Your father bought it." He said, "June of 1988, $62,000. He had been saving since 1981. She said, "I grew up 4 blocks from here." He looked at her. He said, "Where?" She said, "East 38th. My mother still lives there." He said, "I know that block." She said, "I know you do." She set the coffee down. "Mr. Webb, I want to be direct with you. I acquired this parcel through a legal process that was entirely legitimate and that I am not going to apologize for because apologizing for it would be a misrepresentation of how this business works and I don't misrepresent things." He said, "All right." She said, "I also want to be direct about what I read in the file, 36 years of continuous operation. A tax lien that originated from a reassessment dispute, not from negligence. A partial payment history that was on track until a transmission failure. You were 93 days from clearing the balance." He said, 87. She said, 87 days. She looked at him steadily. "I want to offer you a lease arrangement that allows you to continue operating while you exercise the redemption right. The lease rate would be set at what you would have paid in property tax on the original assessment, not the reassessed rate, because the reassessment dispute was legitimate and the reassessed rate was not the correct basis." He said, "What do you want for it?" She said, "I want the parcel eventually. The corridor plan requires this corner. But I don't want it at the cost of destroying what's here. The shop is part of the corridor's character, and I want the corridor to have character or the development is not worth doing." He said, "You're going to raise this block." She said, "I'm going to redevelop this corridor. That's not the same thing. Some buildings come down, some buildings get transformed. Some buildings stay exactly as they are and become part of something larger." She paused. "I don't know yet which category this building is in. I know this corner matters, and I know the history of this building matters, and I know you have a redemption right, and I am not here to prevent you from exercising it." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Why are you here?" She said, "Because I grew up 4 blocks from this shop, because I used to see your father's sign on the way to school. Because I read the file and I understood that the process that put this parcel in my hands worked exactly as it was designed to work and produced exactly the kind of outcome it sometimes produces, and that outcome is not acceptable to me when I have the resources to address it." He said, "Most people with resources to address it don't." She said, "I know." He said, "What's the lease number?" She told him it was fair. He had been paying more in taxes at the reassessed rate. He said, "I'll have my attorney look at the lease." She said, "That's the right answer." He said, "You want coffee before you go?" She held up the cup she had not finished. He nodded. She looked at the photograph of Evelyn Webb on the office wall, visible through the open door. She said, "Is that your mother?" He said, "My father's wife. She died in 2004. He kept her up." She said, "You kept her up." He said, "She belongs in the shop." Dara looked at the photograph for a moment. She stood, set the cup on the counter with care, and walked to the door. She turned and said, "Mr. Webb, what is the most valuable thing in this building?" He did not hesitate. He said, "The diagnostic database." She said, "Tell me about it." Leonard Webb had started keeping records in 1977, when he was working at the Lakewood dealership, and had been given, as a 21st birthday gift by his supervisor, a ledger book and the instruction that the difference between a good mechanic and a great one was that the great one remembered what the car had told them and the good one did not. He had written in the ledger book every diagnostic observation he made from that day forward, not repair records, not invoices, not service histories in the formal sense, but observations. What a particular symptom sounded like. What the pattern of wear on a particular component suggested about driving habits or mechanical failure. What the combination of symptoms in a particular vehicle pointed toward before the formal diagnosis confirmed it. The ledger books had accumulated over 37 years of Leonard's working life. There were 41 of them. They occupied 2 shelves in the Webb Automotive back office, organized by year, in Leonard's handwriting that became more abbreviated over time as the shorthand he had developed grew more efficient. They covered every vehicle type that had come through the shop from 1977 to 2014, with a concentration on domestic vehicles, General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, that reflected the customer base of a Cleveland mechanic in those decades, and with a growing attention to import vehicles, and then to early hybrid and electronic systems as the industry changed. Marcus had digitized them. Over 4 years, starting in the winter after his father's death and continuing on the slow evenings when Aaliyah was asleep and the shop was closed, he had transcribed every entry in every ledger into a structured database he had built in Microsoft Access, and then migrated to a purpose-built application he had commissioned from a software developer at Cleveland State who had done it as a consulting project for $3,000. The database contained 41,732 individual diagnostic observations, indexed by vehicle make, model, year, symptom description, and the specific diagnostic pathway Leonard had followed from symptom to cause. It also contained 12 years of Marcus's own observations, entered in the same format, extending the record from 2014 to the present. The database was not a product. It had not been designed to be a product. It had been designed by Marcus as a tool for his own work, for the shop's institutional memory, and for the specific purpose of ensuring that what Leonard had learned over 37 years was not lost when Leonard died. Marcus had been 27 when he realized that the ledger books were going to die with his father if he did not do something, because knowledge in a ledger book that only the ledger book's author could fully interpret was knowledge that was one death away from being gone. The transcription project was the answer to that realization. He showed Dara the database on the shop computer, an aging Dell Tower running Windows 10 that Marcus had upgraded 3 times by replacing the RAM and the hard drive rather than the machine, because the machine still worked and working machines did not need replacing. He pulled up an entry at random. A 2008 GMC Sierra with an intermittent stall at idle, entered in 2011 with Leonard's diagnostic pathway and the ultimate cause. A crankshaft position sensor intermittently losing ground through a corrosion point in the engine harness that was specific to this engine series in this model year in northern climates where road salt accelerated the corrosion timeline. He said, the dealer's diagnostic system would not have found this. It would have cleared the code, charged the customer for a sensor replacement, and sent them home. 2 weeks later, the problem recurs. The customer comes back. The process repeats. Dara said, and your database found it. He said, my father found it in 2011. He wrote it down. When I saw the same symptom pattern on a different Sierra in 2017, I found his entry in 40 seconds. She said, 40 years of diagnostic observations. He said, 41,000 entries. More than half of them represent problems that the manufacturer's technical service bulletins don't cover because they weren't systematic enough to generate a TSB. Individual patterns, regional patterns, climate-specific failure modes. He paused. Stuff that only exists in here because my father wrote it down and I wrote it down and I put it together. She said, have you shown this to anyone? He said, my regular customers know I'm good at diagnosing things nobody else can find. They don't know why. She said, the software developer who built the application. He said, he built the front end, he doesn't have the data. She said, is the data backed up? He said, 3 external drives, 1 at the shop, 1 at my house, 1 at my aunt's house in Garfield Heights. She said, your aunt's house. He said, she lives far enough away that if there's a flood or a fire that gets my house and the shop, Garfield Heights probably isn't affected. Dara looked at the computer screen for a moment. She said, Mr. Webb, I want to ask you something directly. He said, ask. She said, have you ever considered what this data is worth to an automotive company, to a fleet operator, to anyone in the diagnostic technology space? He said, it's my father's work, it's my work, it's not for sale. She said, I didn't ask if it was for sale, I asked if you'd considered what it's worth. He looked at her. He said, what are you thinking? She said, I'm thinking I need to make a call before I answer that question properly. She stood. The lease offer stands regardless. I want you to know that what we discussed this morning has nothing to do with what I'm thinking about the database. Those are 2 separate things. He said, are they? She said, they are, but they might end up in the same place. Aaliyah had been coming to the shop after school since she was 5. She came on her bicycle in the warm months and in Marcus's truck in the winter, and she had a desk in the back office. A child's desk that Marcus had bought at a second-hand furniture place on Carnegie for $30, and that was sized for a 5-year-old, but that Aaliyah had outgrown without either of them remarking on it. The way children outgrew things in single-parent households, where the parent was focused on keeping more significant things intact. She did homework at the desk and read at the desk, and occasionally came to the bay doorway and watched Marcus work with the focused attention she had inherited from both parents, and that expressed itself as an unusual ability for an 8-year-old to sit still, when the situation rewarded stillness. She had found the ledger books at 6, on an afternoon when Marcus was on a particularly stubborn diagnostic problem, and had been in the database for an hour without finding what he needed. She had climbed onto the stool near the office shelves. She used the stool for the upper shelves and had been using it since she could climb, and pulled ledger number 12 down and opened it and tried to read it. She had come to the bay door and said, Dad, I can't read this. He had looked at the ledger. He had said, that's your grandfather's handwriting. She had said, what does it say? He had put down the diagnostic probe and taken the ledger and read her the entry. A 1989 Ford Thunderbird with a brake pull, and Leonard's systematic elimination of the obvious causes before arriving at a seized caliper guide pin that was partially releasing rather than fully seizing, which produced a pull that appeared and disappeared depending on temperature. He had explained to Aaliyah at 6 what a caliper guide pin was and why temperature affected its behavior, because she had asked, and the question deserved a real answer. She had said, "He figured that out just from listening to the car," Marcus had said. "He figured it out from listening to the car and thinking about what the car was trying to tell him." She had said, "And now it's in the book so you don't have to figure it out again." He had looked at his daughter for a moment and had understood that she had grasped, at 6, the essential point that most people missed, that the ledger was not a record of what had been done but a record of how to think, and that the how to think was the irreplaceable part. After Dara's first visit to the shop, Aaliyah had come in on the following Saturday, which was her day at the shop, and had found Marcus at the computer with the database open and an expression she recognized as the thinking face rather than the working face. She said, "What happened?" He said, "A woman from a real estate company came by." She said, "The one who bought the shop." He said, "I told you about that." She said, "You told me there was a problem. I figured out the rest." She sat on her desk stool and looked at him. "What did she want?" He said, "She offered a fair lease. She also asked about the database." Aaliyah was quiet for a moment. She said, "Grandpa's ledgers." He said, "And my records, everything." She said, "What did you say?" He said, "I said it wasn't for sale." She was quiet again. She said, "But," he said, "she wasn't asking if it was for sale. She was asking if I'd thought about what it was worth." Aaliyah looked at the ledger books on the shelf. She was 8 years old. She looked at them with the expression she had when she was thinking about something that had multiple parts and she was assembling the parts. She said, "Grandpa wrote them so you wouldn't lose what he knew. You put them in the computer so Grandpa's knowing wouldn't die." She paused. "If someone else could use them too, more people would have Grandpa's knowing. That doesn't mean you're selling it." Marcus looked at his daughter for a long moment. She said, "Is that right?" He said, "That might be right." She said, "Can I have a sandwich? I finished my homework." He made her a sandwich. He sat with the idea his 8-year-old had just handed him and turned it over and looked at it from the angles that required looking at. Dara had made the call she needed to make before she could answer Marcus's question about what she was thinking. The call was to a woman named Patricia Ez, who ran the automotive technology practice at a venture capital firm in Detroit that Dara had worked with twice before on portfolio company transactions that had involved automotive-adjacent assets. Patricia was not a car person in the mechanical sense. She was a technology person in the pattern recognition sense, which was the sense that mattered for what Dara was trying to understand. Dara described the database without naming the source. She described its structure, its volume, its indexing methodology, its specific coverage of failure modes not captured by manufacturer TSBs, and the regional and climate-specific data that gave it a geographic depth that no national database replicated. Patricia had been quiet for approximately 4 seconds, which was Patricia's equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. Then she had asked 3 questions, each of which Dara had been able to answer because she had asked Marcus the same questions on the Thursday evening after the shop visit by text, and Marcus had answered them with the precision she had come to expect. After the 3rd answer, Patricia had said, "Dara, who has this?" Dara had said, "A mechanic in Cleveland." Patricia had said, "A mechanic." Dara had said, "With 41,000 entries and a family documentation practice going back to 1977. Patricia had been quiet again. Then she had said, "The diagnostic AI companies, the ones building repair guidance systems, the ones who want to get out of the dealership model and into the independent shop model, their fundamental problem is training data. The OBDII data is abundant. The pre-OBDII data and the non-code symptom data and the regional variance data is almost non-existent in any structured form. Do you understand what I'm describing?" Dara had said, "I think so, keep going." Patricia had said, "The most expensive diagnostic problems in the industry are the ones that don't throw codes. The intermittent problems, the combination symptom problems, the climate-specific problems. Those problems cost the industry billions annually in unnecessary parts replacement and repeat shop visits and lost customer trust. A training dataset that addresses those problems specifically at 41,000 observations with the indexing structure you're describing is not a curiosity. It is a foundational asset for any company trying to build in this space." Dara had said, "What is it worth?" Patricia had named a range. The range had a floor that was 7 figures and a ceiling that depended on how the data was structured, validated, and positioned. Dara had said, "The owner says it's not for sale." Patricia had said, "Everything is for sale at the right structure." Dara had said, "This man is not a person for whom that sentence is true." Patricia had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "Then what is the right structure for this person?" Dara had said, "That is what I am trying to figure out." She went back to the shop on a Tuesday. She brought nothing except the conversation she had had with Patricia and the follow-up research she had done over the weekend, which had included reading every patent filing and product announcement from 6 automotive diagnostic AI companies in the previous 24 months. She had identified what each company was claiming, what each company's training data gap actually was, and which of them had the capital structure and the strategic motivation to pay for what Marcus Webb had sitting on 2 shelves in his back office. She laid this out for Marcus in the waiting area over the $12 Mr. Coffee, without simplifying and without dramatizing, because she had found on the first visit that he absorbed information the way she did, completely and without the need for it to be packaged. He said, "You spent your weekend on this." She said, "I spent time on it, yes." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because I know what undervalued assets look like. I have built a career on identifying them." "Your database is the most undervalued asset I have encountered in 8 years of doing this professionally," he said, "and you want to help me monetize it." She said, "I want to help you structure an agreement that compensates you correctly for the value you and your father created, and that preserves the conditions under which the data means what it means, which is a working mechanic in a working shop who continues to add to it." He said, "A licensing arrangement." She said, "A licensing arrangement with equity participation and a continued contribution clause. You license the existing data. You continue contributing new observations at a rate that maintains the data's currency. The company's access is contingent on your continued involvement." She paused. "You are not selling your father's work. You are allowing it to do what your daughter said it could do, give more people your father's knowing." He was very still for a moment. He said, "You talked to Aaliyah." She said, "You told me what she said on Thursday by text." He said, "I did." She said, "She was right." He said nothing for a moment. He looked at the photograph on the office wall. He looked at the ledger books on the shelf, visible through the open door. He said, "What company are you thinking?" She said, "I have a short list of 3. I want you to meet all of them before you decide, because the company matters as much as the number. Your continued involvement means they need to be people you can work with for a long time." He said, "And the shop?" She said, "The shop stays, the lease stays, the redemption right stays. None of this changes the property conversation." He said, "You're doing 2 separate things here." She said, "I told you they might end up in the same place." Marcus had not talked about Leonard Webb in any formal sense since the funeral, which was the way certain kinds of loss worked. The loss that was also an inheritance, where the grief and the responsibility occupied the same space and could not be fully separated. He talked about Leonard in the functional sense daily, because the shop was Leonard and the database was Leonard, and every time he opened the ledger books to find an entry he was, in a way that was not metaphorical, having a conversation with his father. But the formal sense, the telling of who Leonard was and what he had built and why it mattered, he had not done. The people who knew already knew. The people who didn't know didn't need to. That had been his operational assumption, and it had held until a woman in a charcoal blazer bought his shop for $10,000 and then came back 2 days later to ask him what was in the database. He drove to his Aunt Marlene's house in Garfield Heights on a Sunday, the Sunday before the first meeting with the diagnostic company that Dara had arranged, and sat at her kitchen table with the external hard drive that she kept for him in the drawer beside the microwave, and told her what was happening. Marlene was 67, Leonard's sister, the person who had been at the shop the day Leonard died and who had called Marcus at work. She was retired from the Cleveland School District, where she had been a principal for 16 years, and she brought to every conversation the specific combination of warmth and precision that Marcus had observed in every great teacher. The warmth that said your experience is real, and the precision that said your experience is also context for what we are about to think about carefully. She listened to the full account without interrupting. When he was done, she said, "Your father would say you're overthinking the sentimental part and underthinking the practical part." He said, "What do you mean?" She said, "He would say the work does not become less his because more people use it. The work becomes more his. The more people who know what he figured out, the more Leonard Webb is alive in the world." She looked at him. "That's the sentimental part that you're overthinking," he said, "and the practical part I'm underthinking." She said, "The building, Aaliyah, the redemption right." She set down her coffee. "Marcus, your father bought that building so it would be there for you. He saved for 7 years because he wanted you to have something that could not be taken, and then something came along and almost took it, and now something else is coming along that might put it back." He said, "If the numbers are what Dara thinks they are." She said, "Do you trust her assessment?" He said, "She drove a 5-year-old Honda Accord to the shop." Marlene looked at him. He said, "She didn't have to do that. She could have sent a representative. She could have handled it through attorneys. She came herself in her own car at 7:25 in the morning, and she sat in my father's waiting area in my father's chair, and she drank coffee from my father's coffee machine." He paused. "She didn't perform anything. She just came." Marlene said, "Then meet the companies." He said, "I'm meeting them Tuesday." She said, "Take Aaliyah." He said, "It's a Tuesday." "She has school." Marlene said, "Tell the school she has a family business appointment because she does." He looked at his aunt. He said, "She's 8. Marlene said, "I know how old she is. I was at the hospital when she was born." A pause. "She told you to let more people have her grandfather's knowing. She's earned the right to be there when it happens." The 3 meetings were arranged by Dara over 2 weeks in April, each in the Prospect Capital Conference Room on Euclid Avenue, because Dara had determined that the meetings should happen on neutral ground that was neither the shop nor the company's own offices. Her conference room was neutral ground. She provided the room, the introductions, and the technical summary document that Patricia Ez had helped her structure, and then she sat at the end of the table and said almost nothing, because it was not her meeting in the substantive sense. Aaliyah sat beside Marcus at each meeting. She had brought a notebook and wrote things down. The company's representatives had not expected her, and had displayed a range of responses to her presence that Marcus had noted carefully. The first company's lead representative had addressed all subsequent remarks to Marcus and had visibly recalibrated his vocabulary when Aaliyah's notebook appeared. The second company's team had directed one genuine question to Aaliyah and had listened to her answer with the attention it deserved. The third company's CTO had spent 40 minutes asking Aaliyah questions about the indexing structure and the climate-specific categories and had taken notes of her answers. The third company was a diagnostic software firm called Aptes Technologies, headquartered in Ann Arbor, founded 8 years earlier by 2 former automotive engineers who had left a major OEM to build what they had been unable to build inside it. They had 73 employees. They had Series B funding that had closed 14 months earlier. They had a product that was in use at 640 independent repair shops across the Midwest, and that was being piloted at a national fleet operator in Dallas. Their fundamental limitation, as their CTO explained in the meeting with a directness that Marcus appreciated, was the data that Dara had described to Patricia as the non-code symptom data, the climate-specific patterns, the regional failure mode intelligence that 40 years in a Cleveland shop produced, and that no database they had access to contained. Aaliyah had asked the CTO, "If my grandfather's observations get into your system, will the people using the system know it was him who figured it out?" The CTO had said, "How would you want it to work?" She had said, "I want there to be a name attached to it. When a mechanic uses one of Grandpa's observations, I want it to say Leonard Webb figured this out." The CTO had looked at the product lead beside her. He had said, "We would need to build a provenance layer. We've been thinking about provenance for contributor data anyway. This would be the forcing function." Aaliyah had said, "Good." Marcus had said nothing. He had been watching the room. The meeting had been going for 50 minutes at that point, and the CTO had been writing in her own notebook for most of the 50 minutes, and the product lead had pulled up 3 features in the Aptes interface on his laptop and described how they could be adapted, and the whole energy of the room had the quality of people who had found a problem they had been looking for and were working out the solution in real time. After the meeting in the elevator, Aaliyah had said to Marcus, "That's the one." He had said, "What makes you say so?" She had said, "She wrote in her notebook the whole time. When someone writes that much, it means they're thinking, not performing." Marcus had looked at his daughter. She had her mother's clinical observation and her grandfather's notebook habit, and she had arrived at the right answer before he had. He said, "You're probably right." She said, "I know I'm right." She was right. The negotiation with Aptes Technologies took 11 weeks. Patricia Ez served as Marcus's technical advisor, engaged through a standard advisory arrangement that Dara had suggested, and that Patricia had agreed to at a rate that Marcus's attorney had confirmed was fair. Marcus's attorney was a woman named Beverly Acaffer who practiced commercial law in Cleveland and who had handled the shop's legal work for 4 years, and who had, upon reading the initial term sheet from Aptes, called Marcus to say that this was the most interesting thing she had worked on in 12 years of practice. The deal that emerged after 11 weeks had 5 material components. The first was a licensing fee for the existing database, 41,732 observations plus the software architecture, which was paid as an upfront cash payment that was, when Marcus received it, the largest single number he had seen associated with his own name on any document. The second was a royalty structure on Aptes's revenue from features built on or informed by the web data, calculated as a percentage of attributable product revenue with a floor and a cap that Patricia had negotiated to reflect the data's foundational nature rather than its marginal contribution. The third was an equity grant in Aptes, at a percentage that reflected the data's materiality to the company's core product. The fourth was a 5-year continued contribution agreement under which Marcus would add a minimum of 500 new observations per year, with the Leonard Web provenance attribution built into the interface, as Aaliyah had specified. The fifth was a right of first refusal for Marcus on any future sale or licensing of the web data by Aptes. The combined value of components 1 through 3, at the time of signing, was in the range of $4 million when the equity was marked at current valuation, and the royalty was modeled at Aptes's projected revenue trajectory. Marcus exercised the tax lien redemption right on the day the first payment cleared. The property on Prospect Avenue was his again, in the formal sense of the deed, 22 months after the lien had been filed and 7 months after Dara Osai had purchased it at auction for $10,200. She transferred it back to Marcus at the redemption price, which was the lien amount plus the statutory penalties and her legal fees, which she had not inflated and had in fact absorbed a portion of, which Marcus's attorney had noted and which Marcus had acknowledged without elaboration because the acknowledgement did not require elaboration. On the day the deed transferred back, Dara sent Marcus a text that said, "Congratulations." He replied, "Thank you." She replied, "The lease offer is still open if you want a formal document for your records." He replied, "I'll keep the deed." She replied, "Good answer." The Prospect Capital Midtown Corridor project reached its full acquisition phase in the spring of the year after the Aptes deal closed. All 27 parcels were in hand. The development plan, which Dara had been refining for 3 years with her project architect, and which had been through 2 rounds of community engagement meetings and 1 round of City Planning Commission review, was approved in April with the kind of broad support that plans received when they had been built with the neighborhood rather than announced to it. The plan preserved 11 of the 27 buildings. Webb Automotive Service on the corner was one of them. The architect had incorporated it into the street-level program as a working garage with a glass garage door and facade lighting that made the service bays visible from the street, on the principle that a working corridor had working things in it, and that a mechanic's shop at a pedestrian node communicated something about a neighborhood that no amount of curated retail could replicate. Marcus had reviewed the design drawings with the focused attention he applied to diagnostic problems and had made 2 comments. The first was that the glass garage door would create a viewing angle into the bay that he was comfortable with if the lighting was designed to show the work rather than the worker, by which he meant he did not want the shop to become a performance for the people walking by. The architect had understood and had adjusted the lighting plan. The second comment was that the photograph of Evelyn Webb should appear in the final design somewhere visible from the street, because she was part of the shop's history, and the shop's history was what justified keeping it. The architect had proposed a format and Marcus had approved it. Dara had come to the shop in October, the first October after the deed transfer, for no particular reason that she stated. She arrived at 7:25 as she had on the first visit in the same Honda Accord, and Marcus had the coffee going. They sat in the waiting area chairs. Aaliyah was at school. The shop had the particular morning quiet of a place before the work started, before the bay doors opened and the first vehicle came in. She said, "The groundbreaking is in March." He said, "I know, you sent me the schedule." She said, "I want you there." He said, "I'll be there." She said, "The project architect wants to do a piece in the corridor streetscape that features the history of the buildings being preserved, the long-standing businesses. She wants to include this shop in the series." He said, "What does that look like?" She said, "A wall panel at the corner, exterior, the shop's history in brief, 1988 Leonard Webb, the photograph of your grandmother, the $62,000 and the 7 years of saving." She paused. "The street should know where it came from." He looked at the office wall at Evelyn's photograph. He looked at the ledger books on the shelf. He said, "What about my father's quote?" She said, "What quote?" He said, "He had a thing he said about diagnostic work. He said, every car is trying to tell you something. Your job is to be quiet enough to hear it." Dara was still for a moment. She said, "That goes on the wall." He said, "Yeah." She said, "I want to ask you something I should have asked on the first visit." He said, "Ask." She said, "The morning of the auction, when you were at the Children and Family Services office, What was the dispute about? He said. School enrollment. They had Aaliyah's address wrong in the system, generated an out-of-district notice. Threatened her enrollment at the school she'd been in since kindergarten. She said, did you resolve it? He said, took 3 hours and a supervisor. Yes. She said, so you were at the county building fighting for your daughter's school on the same morning you lost your father's shop. He said, yes. She was quiet. She looked at the office wall. She said, the system produced 2 things that morning. One of them is fixable. One of them should not have happened. He said, both of them happened. She said, yes. He said, and here we are. She said, here we are. The morning light was coming through the bay doors at the low October angle that hit the concrete floor and the tool chests, and the lift in the way of a workshop in early autumn, when the light was honest and specific, and didn't try to be anything other than light. The Aptys Technologies interface update that implemented the provenance attribution layer went live in the second quarter of the year after the deal closed. It appeared in the diagnostic guidance interface as a small byline beneath any observation that had originated from the web database. A line of text in a secondary font that said, observation contributed by Leonard Webb, Webb Automotive Service, Cleveland, Ohio, 1977-2014. The Aptys product team had named the attribution feature the web layer in their internal documentation, which Marcus learned when the CTO sent him a note explaining the internal naming and asking if he had any objection. He had no objection. He had read the note 3 times and then forwarded it to Marlene in Garfield Heights without comment. She had replied with 2 words, he'd know. Aaliyah found out about the feature when Marcus showed her the interface update on a Saturday afternoon in the back office. She looked at the byline on the screen, Leonard Webb, Webb Automotive Service, Cleveland, Ohio, and was quiet for a long time. She said, how many mechanics will see this? Marcus said, Aptys has 640 shops currently. They're projecting 2,000 by end of year. She said, 2,000 mechanics will see Grandpa's name. He said, when they look up one of his observations. Yes, she said, and the cars that get fixed because of his observations, those mechanics will know it was him. He said, yes. She was quiet again. She was 9 by then, 9 going on the particular kind of 10 that children became when they had absorbed a sustained complexity. She looked at the ledger books on the shelf. She said, Dad, I want to learn to write the observations the way he wrote them. He said, you mean contribute to the database? She said, I mean eventually, when I know enough to have things worth writing. She paused. But I want to learn the format, the way of thinking about it, so I know how. He said, that's a years-long project. She said, I know, I'm not in a hurry. He got a blank ledger book from the supply of Staples composition notebooks he kept in the parts room, because he had migrated his own observations to digital but kept the paper habit for the initial capture in the same way his father had. He handed it to Aaliyah. She opened it to the first page. She wrote at the top in the careful handwriting of someone who understood that a first page was a declaration. Aaliyah Webb, Webb Automotive Service, Cleveland, Ohio. She put the year beneath it. She looked at him and said, what do I write first? He said, you write what you see, what the car is trying to tell you, everything you notice that doesn't match what's supposed to be there. She said, and if I don't know what it means yet? He said, you write it anyway. The meaning comes later. The observation has to come first. She nodded with the focused seriousness that was her confirmation that she had understood and was filing the information correctly. She looked at the notebook. She looked at the bay doors open to the October afternoon. She looked at the car on the lift. She said, can I come under the car? He said, get your safety glasses. She got them. She came under the car. She wrote in the notebook what she saw. The groundbreaking for the Prospect Capital Midtown Corridor project was on a Thursday morning in March, with the light sharp and the air cold, and a crowd of 200 people standing on the corner of Prospect Avenue where Leonard Webb had built something in 1988, and Marcus Webb had kept it alive, and Dara Osai had bought it for $10,000 and given it back. The wall panel at the corner had been installed the previous week. It was 48 inches wide and 36 inches tall, mounted on a steel frame anchored to the building's corner facade, and it showed a photograph of Leonard Webb in the shop in 1991, a photograph that Marlene had found in a box of Leonard's things, and that showed him at the lift with the specific focused expression of a man doing work he understood completely. Beside the photograph was the history in brief, and below both was the sentence, every car is trying to tell you something. Your job is to be quiet enough to hear it. Aaliyah had approved the font choice. At the groundbreaking, the city council representative spoke and the project architect spoke, and Dara spoke briefly in the way she did most things, directly, without ceremony that the moment did not require. She said that the corridor project was built on the principle that a neighborhood's value was in its continuity as much as its change, and that the best developments were the ones that preserved what was irreplaceable while making space for what was necessary, and that the corner they were standing on was the proof of concept for that principle. She did not say Marcus's name in the remarks. He had asked her not to, and she had understood why without requiring an explanation. The wall told the story. The shop told the story. The remarks were not the story. After the remarks and the photographs and the moment when the ceremonial shovels broke the frozen March ground, Marcus and Aaliyah stood at the corner for a few minutes before they had to open the shop. Aaliyah was in her school coat with the notebook in her backpack. She looked at the wall panel and then at the street and then at the bay doors of the shop behind them. She said, "Grandpa would have stood exactly here." Marcus said, "I know." She said, "He saved for 7 years to have this corner, and then he stayed for 30 years. Marcus said, "He did." She said, "Did you tell Dara how much he liked this corner specifically, the corner, not just the building?" He said, "He used to say you could see 4 blocks from this corner. He said a man should be able to see what was coming." Aaliyah looked at the 4 blocks. She said, "You can still see 4 blocks." He said, "Yes." Dara came to stand beside them. She had a coffee from the event table. She looked at the wall panel and then at the 4 blocks and then at Aaliyah. She said, "Your grandfather would have liked today." Aaliyah said, "He'd have had opinions about the panel font." Dara said, "So did you." Aaliyah said, "I was right." Dara looked at Marcus. He spread his hands in the gesture of a man who had long since accepted that his daughter was going to be right about most things and had found this more useful than humbling. She made the sound that was her real laugh, the unguarded kind that surfaced when something was both funny and true simultaneously. Marcus had been learning its register across 11 months of a relationship that had no exact category: business partner, neighbor in the corridor sense, the person who bought his shop and gave it back and sat in his father's chair and drank his father's coffee and was standing now on his father's corner in the March light. He thought about his father on this corner in 1988 with $62,000 that had taken 7 years to accumulate, looking at a block that nobody had wanted and understanding that it was worth wanting. He thought about the ledger books. He thought about Diane's payment system and the truck transmission and the 87 days. He thought about Aaliyah in the notebook's first page with the year beneath her name, learning how to write down what she saw before she knew what it meant. He thought about the sentence on the wall, "Every car is trying to tell you something. Your job is to be quiet enough to hear it." He had been hearing the same thing from more than cars for the past 11 months. The shop had been telling him something. The ledger books had been telling him something. The 8-year-old with the notebook and the 9-year-old under the car had been telling him something. He had been, in the March cold on his father's corner, quiet enough to hear it. He thought this was probably the most important thing his father had ever taught him and the one that had taken the longest to learn. He opened the shop. He raised the bay doors. He started the coffee. The first car pulled in at 8.